The void between star systems had a way of making soldiers feel small. Commander of Wrath of the Tharkin Confederacy had served in deep space for 30 years. He had seen nebulas the size of solar systems, dead planets still glowing from ancient wars, stars collapsing inward like old men folding at the knees. He had seen things that would end the sleep of anyone who had not spent a career learning to look without feeling. The darkness never surprised him anymore. That was what he thought until his sensor officer made a noise. It was not a word. It was the kind of sound a person makes when the brain sees something and refuses to process it. A clipped breath, a half-swallowed syllable, then nothing. Breath crossed the bridge of the scout vessel Asterisk in 4 steps. Report. Sensor Officer Tun pointed at her screen. Her hand was not quite steady. The object sat at the outer edge of scanner range. On a standard readout, it was barely a mark, a smear of mass and energy that could have been debris, could have been a rogue rock, could have been instrument error. Breath had dismissed 100 such marks in his career. Then he looked at the readings attached to it. What is the mass estimate? Tun ran the numbers again, then once more. Larger than any single vessel in the Confederacy fleet, sir, by a significant margin. Power signature. That is the part I can't explain. She pulled the data up on the secondary display. The core signature reads as a fusion drive variant class unknown, but it's layered. There are secondary signatures underneath it that I have never seen categorized. Whatever is generating them is drawing power at a rate that should not be physically possible for a ship that size without. She stopped. Without what, officer? Without being designed for something we have never built. Breath looked at the shape on the screen. The sensors were still refining. The object was long, brutally long. Armor plating built in overlapping sections like a creature that had grown its own shell over many years. Each layer added on top of an older one. Forward sections carried weapon implements large enough to register as separate structures on the mass scanner. The hull showed damage, deep damage. Scoring from weapons fire, impact craters, sections that had been breached and resealed with what looked like emergency plating welded over emergency plating over the original hull. A ship that had been hurt so many times, it had started wearing its scars like armor. The sensors finished their refinement. He saw the markings on the hull, faded, half-scraped by time and radiation, and whatever the ship had passed through on its way to wherever it was now, but unmistakable to anyone who had studied the records of the last Great War. A flag design, 2 letters repeating in a grid, a designation number painted in what had once been white, but had aged to the color of old bone. ISV-7 Reckoning. The bridge went quiet. Not the quiet of people saying nothing, the deeper quiet of people stopping mid-breath. Everyone on the asterisk knew what ISV meant. Interstellar vessel, human designation, human registry. A ship built by the species the Confederacy had not seen in 50 years. The species the Confederacy had officially, in careful diplomatic language, declared no longer a relevant geopolitical force. Breath's hand found the communications panel, secure channel to High Command, Priority 1. 50 years was a long time. The war between humanity and the Confederacy of Tharkin had lasted 6 years by the calendar, but it had lasted much longer in memory. The Confederacy was old. It had absorbed 12 species into its structure over the course of 400 years, sometimes by negotiation, and sometimes by the kind of patient, overwhelming force that made negotiation seem like the wiser option in hindsight. It had fought wars before. It knew how wars worked. Humans did not fight wars the way wars were supposed to work. The conflict began not because humanity had threatened the Confederacy, not because they had attacked a member world or violated treaty lines they had never actually signed. It began because the Confederacy Survey Commission had run a projection, a 100 red-year population and expansion model. The model showed humanity growing at the rate it was growing, and would occupy a third of the Confederacy's strategic buffer zone within a century. The Confederacy's Strategic Council looked at the projection, looked at humanity's industrial capacity, looked at the rate at which human engineering seemed to produce new things they were not supposed to be able to produce yet, and made a decision. Better to push them back while they were still manageable. The first year went as planned. It always did. The Confederacy had numbers, positioning, and centuries of experience in large-scale military logistics. Humanity lost 3 outer colony stations. Their fleet fell back toward their core systems. The Confederacy's analysts wrote assessments that used words like contained and progressing within expected parameters. The second year did not go as planned. Human warships came back different. The Confederacy's engineers reviewed the captures and sensor data and reported with a combination of professional admiration and personal unease that human engineering had done something to their vessels that violated at least 2 principles of optimal mass to thrust ratios. The ships were heavier. They were also faster. They were more heavily armored and carried weapons with a longer effective range than the previous generation. Building faster and heavier at the same time was not supposed to be possible with the technology humanity was known to have. The analysts revised their assessments. In the third year, humanity pushed back. 4 Confederacy battle groups in 40 days. Not routed, not retreated, destroyed. Hull, crew, record, and all. The Confederacy lost more warship tonnage in those 40 days than in the previous 200 years of expansion combined. High Command stopped writing optimistic assessments and started holding emergency sessions. Years 4 and 5 were the kind of grinding city block by city block system by combat that military historians later described in the careful neutral language of people who had not been there. Human soldiers fought with an intensity the Confederacy's ground forces found destabilizing. Not because they were larger or stronger or faster. They were not against the Tharkin or the Vel, but because they fought like losing was genuinely not a concept they had accepted as an option. A unit cut off from support would not surrender. It would find another way. A position that was tactically indefensible would be defended anyway while something new was improvised. They were exhausting in a way that the Confederacy's military doctrine had no category for. Then in the 6th year, silence. The human fleet pulled back to the edge of their home systems. Ground offensive stopped. Communication channels that had carried everything from formal declarations of war to what appeared to be human soldiers sending each other recordings of animals doing amusing things went dead. The Confederacy sent probes toward human space. The probes did not return. After 12 months of this, the Confederacy declared a provisional armistice. No human envoy appeared to sign it. The Confederacy established a surveillance perimeter around the edges of known human space, issued a formal statement about the restoration of regional stability, and quietly stopped talking about the war at official functions. The working theory, as the years turned into decades, was that the war had done something to humanity from the inside, broken something essential. Civilizations did that sometimes. They burned too fast, pushed too hard, and hollowed out without anyone outside noticing until the structure was already gone. The Mach had done it that way. The Volari had nearly done it. Humans, who had always pushed further and harder and faster than anything in their population models suggested they should, had perhaps finally pushed past a limit that even they could not engineer around. The Confederacy had stopped looking. Standing on the bridge of the Keldron Asterisk, staring at the ISV Asterisk reckoning on his sensor display, Breth thought about all of that. The ship was damaged in layers. That was the detail he kept returning to. New scars over older scars. Still, a ship that had not been sitting in dry dock collecting dust. A ship that had been in fights, many of them spread across what looked like years or decades. The hull breaches were old enough that the emergency seals had themselves been damaged and resealed. The armor plating in some sections had been replaced with material that did not quite match the original thicker in places. Welded with techniques that left visible seams because whoever had done the work had not cared about aesthetics, only function. But the ship was not dead. The sensors insisted on this with the quiet persistence of instruments that were simply reporting what they found. The core power signature was low, minimum draw, something like dormancy, but it was there. Something on the asterisk reckoning was still running after all these years in the dark between systems. Crew readings, Breth asked. Tun worked carefully. There's a dampening field around the ship. Strong one, but I'm getting thermal variance in the forward sections consistent with active life support. She paused. And one more thing. Tell me the point defense weapons, the small caliber close-range systems mounted along the hull. She looked up. They're active, sir. Power is flowing to them. They have been active the entire time we have been observing. The ship was barely running. The ship was drifting in deep space with hull breaches and mismatched plating, and a power signature so low it almost did not register. And it had kept the close-range guns hot. It had been out here alone in the dark for what might have been decades, and it had kept the guns running. Breth filed his report to High Command that day. He was precise. He attached every sensor reading, every frame of visual data, his own observations about the damage layering and the weapon activity. He flagged at the end of the report his personal assessment that this object should not be approached by anything short of a full combat group, and that any force sent to investigate should be prepared for the situation to become hostile without warning. High Command responded in less than a standard day, which meant the message had reached someone important, very fast. The response contained two things. First, orders for the Keldron asterisk to maintain position and passive observation until relief arrived. Second, notification that a fleet was being assembled at Tharkin Station. 42 ships, battle cruisers, destroyers, a carrier group, support vessels. More than enough for a single damaged human vessel. More than enough for most things that existed. The fleet would arrive in 18 days. The orders also carried a priority marker Breth had seen used twice in his career. It meant the target was to be preserved if possible. It meant someone in High Command wanted the asterisk reckoning intact more than they wanted it destroyed. It meant someone up the chain had looked at the sensor data and decided that whatever was still running inside that ship was something worth having. Breth held his position for 18 days. The reckoning did not move. It breathed. That was the only word Tun used for it after the third day. And Breth stopped correcting her because it was accurate. The power signature fluctuated in slow rhythms that were not random. In and out, low and slightly less low. A cycle that repeated every several hours with the patience of something that was waiting and had long ago made its peace with how long the wait might be. On the 9th day, Breth saw a flicker on the long-range sensors, a shape at the very edge of detection range. It was there for less than 3 seconds, then gone. He could not get a clean reading. He logged it in the daily report and did not sleep well afterward. He did not log why. On the 17th day, the fleet arrived. 42 ships dropped out of faster-than-light travel behind the asterisk cauldron in the rolling flash of energy that attended every transition, and the dark between stars suddenly felt smaller. Admiral Cass of the Tharkin Navy transmitted from his flagship, "The Tharkins will asterisk a vessel large enough that Breth sometimes had to remind himself the Keldron asterisk was a separate ship, and not a room on the wheel that had wandered off." Commander Vreth Kassa's voice had the particular quality of a man who had never been surprised by anything and intended to keep it that way. Full report. Breth gave it 18 days of observation, compressed and precise. The sensor flickers on day 9. The current status of the dormant power signature is steady. Point defense is still active. Dampening field holding. He pulled up side-by-side comparisons of the damaged layers, the whole composition analysis, the best estimate of the ship's age based on the material degradation. KS listened without interrupting. He reviewed the data. He conferred briefly with his own sensor officers and received their confirmations. Then he sat back with the settled stillness of someone who had made a decision before he sat down. "One ship." The Admiral said, "Yes, sir." "Human construction, 5 to 7 decades without resupply or documented port activity. Best estimate, yes. And it's still powered." "Yes, Admiral. Still powered, still armed. Something on that ship has been running continuously for a very long time." Cass was quiet for a moment. Not the thoughtful quiet of someone uncertain, but the exact quiet of someone organizing what they already knew into the order they intended to present it. "We move in at 0600. Formation Alpha. All weapons powered but targeting systems offline. I want this to read as an approach, not an attack. We will attempt communication on all human-registered frequencies. He paused. If there is no response in 2 hours, we will send a boarding team. Breath looked at the sensor screen at the shape in the dark with its slow breathing and its gun still warm. And if it does respond, Admiral Cass looked at him directly through the calm display. Behind the certainty, behind the practice command composure, something moved. It was brief. It was small, but Breath had served long enough to recognize it. Then Cass said, "We will have a conversation." The fleet formed up through the night cycle. 42 warships moving into the precise geometric pattern of a military approach. Each ship confirmed weapon status. Each captain received the formation order and the communication protocols. The approach corridor was plotted and transmitted. The carrier held back with its fighter complement on standby. Everything was professional. Everything was correct. Every protocol that 30 years of deep space military doctrine had developed for approaching an unknown contact was being followed with the care of people who wanted to be very sure they had done everything right. They began their final approach at 0600. They did not know what they were moving toward. They thought they were a damaged relic, a ghost of a dead war, a piece of history that had somehow kept itself running out of stubbornness or malfunction, or some combination of the two. They thought they were going to collect it. The asterisk reckoning sat in the dark and waited. The approach took 4 hours. 42 ships moved through the dark in the clean formation of a military force that had done this before against many things, and had always won. Admiral Cass watched from the bridge of the Tharkans, as the distance between his fleet and the ISV asterisk reckoning collapsed on the navigation display sector by sector, kilometer by kilometer. He had been in command of fleet engagements 17 times. He had fought the Vel separatist faction at the Third Halo, the mock remnant fleets, a border dispute with a species so recently contacted they did not yet have a formal name in the Confederacy registry. He had won all 17. He looked at the asterisk reckoning on the forward visual display and felt something he would not have named in front of his crew. The ship was larger than the sensor readings had made it seem. That was the first thing he noticed as the distance closed. Sensor readings gave you mass and dimension in numbers. Numbers could be held at arm's length. Seeing the actual shape of the thing that was different, it filled the display not like a ship, but like a structure. Like something that had been built to stay. The layered armor caught the distant starlight and held it in dull patches across hundreds of meters of scarred hull. The weapon implementations along the forward sections were not merely large, they were architecturally large, built into the frame of the ship rather than mounted on it. As though whoever designed the asterisk reckoning had decided the weapons were not equipment, but bone. The hull bore its damage openly. No attempt had been made to clean or conceal the scoring and the craters and the revealed breaches. They were just there, accumulated across what looked like a very long and very violent history. The point defense guns tracked the fleet's approach. Cass had been told about this. He had seen it in breath sensor data. He had mentally categorized it as a residual automated function, a system running on old programming doing what it had been told to do, without anyone behind it. It was different to watch it happen in real time. The small guns did not swivel randomly. They moved with the fleet. They adjusted as the formation adjusted. Whatever was tracking them was aware of the formation and watching it update. Communication attempt. Cass said all registered human frequencies. Standard hailing protocol. His communications officer transmitted on every human frequency in the registry. Military, civilian, emergency, diplomatic. 19 separate channels in rotation. The message was simple. This is Admiral Cass of the Tharkin Confederacy Fleet requesting contact. Please identify and respond. They transmitted for 2 hours. The reckoning did not answer. The dampening field held. The power signature held its slow rhythm. The point defense guns continued to track. After 2 hours, Cass made his decision. Prepare a boarding team, 2 assault transports. I want 40 soldiers, breach equipment, and a technical team capable of interfacing with human systems. He paused. Tell them to be careful. The boarding transports launched from the Tharkans will asterisk at the 2 and 1 to 2 hour mark. They were small, fast vessels built for the precise work of getting soldiers from one ship to another. They crossed the distance to the asterisk reckoning in 11 minutes. During those 11 minutes, the fleet held formation and watched. The transports reached the reckoning asterisk Sol. The boarding team lead transmitted a status update. Hull contact made, selecting breach point. Visual confirmed the hull damage breath sensors had described. The team lead reported that the emergency patches on the hull were more extensive than the sensor imagery had suggested. He reported that some of the patches appeared very recent. Then he reported that the point defense guns had stopped tracking the fleet. They were tracking the transports. K straightened all ships to full weapon readiness targeting systems online. The words were barely out of his mouth. The asterisk reckoning moved, not slowly, not with the gradual power increase of a vessel warming up its drives. One moment it was drifting, the next moment it was awake. Every system, every weapon, every drive comes online simultaneously in a surge of energy that hit the fleet sensors like a physical blow. The dampening field dropped. What was beneath it was a power signature so large and so layered that Cass's sensor officer later said it was like looking at a star that had decided it was a ship. Then the weapons fired. Cass saw the first 3 ships die. He saw them because he was watching the tactical display. He did not understand what he was seeing at first. The reckoning asterisk S forward weapons discharged and 3 of his battle cruisers were simply gone. No explosion, no structural collapse. They were there and then they were not there. And where they had been, there was briefly an expanding cloud of vapor that cooled and darkened in the time it took CS to process what had happened. Return fire. He started the asterisk reckoning and moved through the formation. It did not stay at range. It came in. It drove directly into the geometry of the fleet's formation, and it fired continuously, and it moved in a way that a ship that size was not supposed to be able to move, cutting angles and changing vectors at accelerations that should have killed anyone aboard, and wherever it went, the fleet died. Cass's crew was firing. Every ship in the formation was firing. He could see the weapons impacts on the asterisk reckoning asterisk S hull, or he could see the energy reaching the hull, which was a different thing. The layered armor distributed the impacts in ways his targeting computers flagged as anomalous. Hits that should have penetrated to systems were spreading across the surface. The reckoning was taking damage. He could see sections of hull giving way. See new scars being added to the old ones. But the ship kept moving, and the weapons kept firing, and the fleet kept dying. Destroyer asterisk asterisk gone. Cruiser asterisk Pride of Tharkan asterisk gone. Carrier asterisk Unbroken March. The carrier, the largest ship in his fleet after the Will asterisk, went in a single sustained burst from the reckoning asterisk S main weapons that lasted less than 4 seconds. The tactical display was going dark in clusters. Cass was a fleet commander. He had the instincts of 30 years in the Navy, and those instincts cut through the shock faster than thought could. He did not wait to understand what was happening. He looked at the tactical display, and he made one decision. Emergency FTL jump now. All ships jump now. Some of them got out. The Tharkans will asterisk jump. 6 other ships jumped in the chaos, pulling their FTL drives online in emergency sequence and tearing themselves out of normal space on whatever heading their systems could calculate in the seconds available. 29 ships did not jump in time. Breath watched from the Keldron asterisk, which was small enough and far enough back in the formation to not immediately be a target, and which his survival instincts had driven him to push behind a piece of debris, fielded the moment the reckoning moved. He was running no active systems, no engines, no weapons, no sensors that would put out a signature worth tracking. He was a small object hiding behind a larger object. And he stayed there, and he watched through passive optical pickups as the battle ended. It did not last long. He would later be unable to accurately describe how long it lasted, because the portion of his mind responsible for managing time seemed to have stopped functioning at some point during the engagement. What he could say was that he had watched 42 ships go in and he had watched 29 die, and it had felt like no time at all. The asterisk reckoning moved through the debris cloud of the fleet it had just destroyed. Its hull was damaged, fresh damage on top of the old damage, new scars still glowing at their edges where energy weapons had burned through. Several of its point defense implementations appeared to be destroyed. One of the forward weapon batteries showed breach damage that was venting gases into the void. There were new hull failures along the port side that the ship's automated systems were already attempting to seal with the same emergency plate-over-plate patchwork that covered the old damage. It hurt. It was still very much awake. The asterisk reckoning turned slowly in the debris field, tracking its sensors swept the area. Breath pressed himself and his entire crew, all 12 of them, by force of collective instinct, against the inner bulkhead of the Keldron, as though being physically small inside the ship would help. He breathed. He waited. He did not move the ship. The asterisk reckoning asterisk sensor sweep passed over the debris field, passed over the wreckage of 29 ships now cooling in the void, passed over the asterisk sitting perfectly still behind its cover, running nothing. The sweep continued past. Breath counted to 60 before he let himself exhale. After what he estimated was 30 minutes, he could not be certain. His time sense was still damaged. The reckoning moved. Its main drives engaged in a low burn. The massive ship began moving slowly at first, then with gathering purpose. It set a heading that Breath's passive optical systems could track. He watched it go. It did not go toward Thark in space. It did not go toward human space, or at least not directly. It moved along a heading that his navigation instincts built on 30 years of star charts placed in the direction of the outer systems. The frontier, the places the Confederacy's charts marked as uncharted or unmapped. It moved through the debris of everything it had just destroyed, and it did not slow. Breath gave it 6 hours before he activated his systems. His communications array came online. He transmitted the fleet's emergency frequency. No response. He tried the high command priority channel. Static for a long time, and then a response garbled as though being transmitted through damaged relays. But a response. Someone from one of the ships that had jumped was alive. He recorded his own report. He did not edit it, and he did not select the details carefully. He recorded everything he had seen, everything the passive opticals had captured. Every reading his instruments had taken in the moment before he killed his active systems. He flagged it at every priority level available to his rank, and he transmitted it to high command via every relay in range. Then he sat in the dark for a long time. He thought about what he had seen. He thought about 42 ships and what had happened to 29 of them in a span of time he could not accurately report. He thought about the reckoning *S movement through the formation. The way it had come in close instead of standing off. The way it had moved at accelerations that should not have been possible. The way the armor had distributed the fleet's fire. He thought about something else too. Something he had seen in the optical feed that he had not included in his report yet, because he was not sure what it meant. In the final minutes of the engagement before the asterisk reckoning began its sweep of the debris field, Breath's optical pickups had caught something on the hull of the human ship near the bridge section, an area that the battle damage had scraped partially clear of the grime and radiation darkening that covered most of the hull. There were marks there, not battle damage marks, something deliberate. Tally marks. Long vertical lines with a diagonal cross through every fifth grouped in clusters of 50. Breath had not had time to count them all before the asterisk reckoning turned away. He had counted enough. Whatever those marks were counting, they numbered in the hundreds. He added that detail to his report on his second transmission. Then he plotted a course for the nearest Confederacy station and moved through the debris field of what remained of the 42nd Fleet, alone and slow, while the dark around him held its silence. The wreckage of the fleet drifted, cooling, spreading, pieces of ships that had been proud and certain 6 hours ago, now just matter with no particular purpose. Here, a section of hull plating with a ship's registry number on it. There was a piece of fighter bay equipment still spinning slowly from the force that had separated it from its ship. Somewhere in the debris deep in it, Emergency transponders were broadcasting the survival signals of escape pods. Breath could not stop for them. His ship was not equipped for that many survivors, and he could not afford the time. He logged the transponder coordinates and included them in his transmission. Someone with a rescue vessel would come, he hoped. He pushed the Keldron Asterisk to its best speed and pointed it at home, and did not look at the sensor display for a long time, because looking at the sensor display meant looking at the blank spaces where 42 ships had been, and were now 29 clouds of debris and 13 emergency jumps to unknown headings. He thought about the tally marks. He thought about the fact that the Reckoning had kept those marks, and had been keeping them apparently for a very long time. Someone or something on that ship had been marking something for long enough to fill a section of cleared hole with hundreds of groups of 5. He thought about what you would keep a tally of if you were a warship alone in the dark for 50 years. He decided he did not want the answer to that question. He went home anyway, because the question was coming whether he wanted it or not. Behind him, the debris field drifted. The transponders broadcast their small, hopeful signals into the void. The stars held their positions with complete indifference to everything that had happened beneath them. The Asterisk Reckoning was already gone. The footage reached Tharkin Station before Vire did. He had transmitted everything, the optical recordings, the sensor data, his own voice reports. The signals traveled faster than his ship. By the time the Keldron Asterisk docked at the station's outer ring, the recordings had been viewed in full by 3 separate intelligence departments. The Naval High Command senior staff, and at least one member of the Confederacy Council who had apparently been present when the intelligence briefing room received the transmission and simply did not leave. VE stepped off his ship into a corridor full of uniforms and was immediately surrounded. They did not ask him how he was. They did not mention that he had been alone in the debris field of a destroyed fleet for 11 days. They brought him to a secured briefing room and played his own footage back at him, and asked him to confirm what he was seeing as though he might have forgotten. He confirmed it. He confirmed it again. He was there for 6 hours before they let him eat. The High Command emergency session lasted 3 days. Breath was not in the room for most of it. His rank did not carry that clearance. But the results filtered down through the structure of the Navy in the way results always did, through the careful language of official communications, and the less careful language of officers talking quietly in corridors. The official communication said the engagement with the unregistered human vessel has been reviewed and analyzed. A response framework is being developed. The corridor language said, "No one knows what happened." That was not quite accurate. The weapons analysts knew what happened in the technical sense. They had the sensor data. They had the footage. They could describe the discharge signatures of the Asterisk Reckoning *S main weapons with a level of precision that filled 14 pages. What they could not explain was the physical basis for those signatures. The weapons were producing effects that their existing models did not account for. The closest analogy they could find was in theoretical papers, works published by human physicists in the years just before the war. Speculative work about directed energy manipulation at scales considered impractical by every other civilization's scientific establishment. Impractical. That was the word that appeared in the analysis papers used to describe theories that were apparently now installed on a working warship. The armor analysis was worse. Breath sensor data from the engagement showed the fleet weapons hitting the Asterisk Reckoning and the impact spreading distribution across the hull in a way that should not have happened with conventional armor materials. The Reckoning was damaged by the fleet fire. There was no question about that. But the damage was distributed across a much larger surface area than the impact zone suggested. Something in the armor was spreading the energy laterally, bleeding it out across hundreds of meters of hull before it could concentrate in one place and penetrate. The senior engineer who presented this finding to the weapons committee said in the flat tone of someone reporting facts that personally offended them, "We do not have the material science to build this. We are not close to having the material science to build this." Based on the sensor data, humanity has been building with this material for at least 2 decades. They were developing the theoretical framework for it during the war. A general asked, "So they were building this during the ceasefire?" "It appears so while we thought they had collapsed." "Yes." Silence. the kind that follows a sentence that reorganizes everything before it. The session continued. Breath was called back in on the fourth day, not to give testimony, but because someone had found something, and they wanted him in the room when they showed it to the senior staff. Something was a prisoner. She was human. Her name was Captain Solon Marsh, and she had been captured in the fourth year of the human conflict during a fleet engagement in the Outer Kell system. She was in her late 30s at the time of capture. She was now, by the Confederacy's calendar, adjusted to her species' aging pattern, somewhere in her early 80s. She had been held at a research facility in the Tharkin interior, not mistreated from what the records indicated, but held. Interviewed periodically by military intelligence, studied by the medical and xenobiology departments, because a living human was a research asset that the Confederacy had not expected to have, and they had used it accordingly. They had not spoken to her in 11 years. The intelligence value had been assessed as exhausted. She was being kept alive out of what passed for institutional policy, rather than active purpose. When the briefing room's liaison told Reth about her before they brought him in to observe the interview, he had one immediate response. Why is she still here? The liaison took a moment. We assumed humanity was no longer a functioning civilization. Releasing a prisoner to a collapsed society was not a relevant option. And now the liaison did not answer. They interviewed her in a room that had clearly been cleaned and prepared in the hours before she arrived. She walked in with the careful, deliberate movement of someone whose body had aged, but whose posture had not given up the habit of command. She sat down across from the panel of senior staff and naval intelligence officers, and she looked at them with pale eyes that had spent enough time reading people to skip the surface and go directly to the point. She did not ask why they had brought her there. She said, "You found one of the ships." The room was quiet. The head of naval intelligence, a senior officer named Drivak, who had the professional habit of never showing reaction, showed reaction. He contained it quickly, but Breath had been watching. "What ships?" Drev said. She smiled. It was not a warm expression. It was the expression of someone who had been waiting for a very specific moment and had now arrived at it. "The ones we've been building." There was an investigation immediately. Of course, there had to be a human prisoner who knew about ships that had just destroyed a 42-ship fleet and raised questions that the Confederacy's intelligence structure was not going to sit quietly with. How did she know? What did she know? Was she in communication? But no. She had been in a sealed facility with no outside communications. She had known nothing of the engagement until they showed her the footage to gauge her reaction. She had watched it with the specific expression of someone watching something they had expected and not quite dared to hope for. What she knew because she had been a fleet captain, and she understood what the Confederacy did not. That humanity had not collapsed. She would not tell them everything. Breath watched the interview for 3 hours and watched the intelligence officers push and probe and offer and threaten, and she gave them pieces, enough to confirm what they were dealing with, not enough to tell them what to do about it. What she gave them was this: the silence had been deliberate. The 6 years of war had taught humanity things, the same way the war had taught the Confederacy things, but the lessons were different. The Confederacy had learned that humans were harder to defeat than the expansion projections had suggested. Humanity had learned something more specific. They had learned that the Confederacy was better at conventional fleet warfare, better organized, better supplied, more experienced at the logistics of large-scale interstellar military operations. Fighting the Confederacy conventionally was a fight humanity could sustain, but could not win quickly, and a long war would eventually exhaust them. So, they stopped fighting conventionally. The pullback in the 6th year was not retreat, and it was not collapse. It was preparation. The human civilization withdrew into its core systems, sealed its borders, sent no communications outward, and went to work. The probes the Confederacy had sent into human space in the first years of the silence had been detected and destroyed. That was why they didn't come back. There was nothing missing about those probes. They had simply been found and removed. For decades behind the silence, humanity had been building the work Breath had seen on the asterisk, reckoning the theoretical physics papers, the armor materials, The drive systems that shouldn't work. That was not the end of it. That was the early work. That was what humanity had been doing in the years just before the silence and in the first decade of it. Marsh would not say what the decades after had produced. She would say one thing. She said it calmly, with the tone of someone stating a fact that required no emphasis. The asterisk reckoning is old. It was one of the first built to the new standard. It's been operating independently for a long time. Whatever you encountered out there, that is not the best we have. She said nothing after that. Not because she was done, but because she looked at the room and decided she had said enough. Drevak released breath from the observation room after the interview. He did not speak for several minutes. They stood in a corridor that hummed with the station's life support systems, and Drevak looked at a section of wall and was quiet in the way of someone reorganizing a very large amount of information. She's been here 40 years, Drevak said finally. Yes, Vieth said. She sat in that facility for 40 years knowing this was coming. Breath thought about it, about the patience that required sitting in a room in an enemy facility for 40 years, with information in your head and a face that showed nothing. Waiting for the day when they would finally come to you, which they would because the day was always going to come. Yes, he said again. The council session that followed the intelligence report lasted 2 days and produced a decision that was either bold or desperate, depending on who in the room you asked. They were going to try again, not with a fleet of 42 ships. This time, 160 vessels were drawn from every member world's naval contribution, the largest single force the Confederacy had assembled since the height of the human conflict. The weapons would be the best available. The tactics would be adjusted for what had been learned from the engagement footage. But this time, there would also be something else. Something the Weapons Committee had proposed after watching the footage 14 times and going through the mathematical analysis of the asterisk reckoning *S behavior. The asterisk reckoning had fired on the boarding transports before it fired on the fleet. It had waited until the transports were at full contact, and then it had woken up. It had not fired on the fleet when the fleet first appeared, or during the 2 hours of communication attempts, or during the preparations for boarding. It had waited for the transports. Something on that ship had made a decision. Whatever was running the asterisk reckoning had let the fleet approach, had listened to, or at least registered the communication attempts, and had waited to respond until the act of boarding became imminent. That was not the behavior of a purely automated system. That was something closer to the behavior of something that did not want to be boarded. The Weapons Committee had proposed, don't send troops, send a message. They did not have a human translator on staff. Marsh, when asked, had refused to participate directly, but she had in what Brecht believed was a calculated act of precisely rationed cooperation, written down a specific phrase in the human military communication protocol. A phrase that she said with no further explanation might matter. The fleet was being assembled. The plan was being finalized. In 2 weeks, they would go back. Breath filed a request to be removed from the mission. He had seen the footage from his own optical pickups 40 times in 11 days. He had seen the debris field. He had sat in his scout ship behind a rock and listened to his own breathing while 29 ships died less than 30-kilometer away. The request was denied. He was going back because he was the only senior officer who had been present at both moments, the discovery and the engagement. His direct observational record was considered an asset the mission planning could not afford to waste. Breath accepted this with the resignation of a man who had spent 30 years accepting the decisions of people in larger offices. He went to check on the preparations. He went to review the weapons loadouts and the fleet formation plans and the communication protocols. He did the work because the work was there, and doing it was better than sitting still. He tried not to think about the tally marks. He found himself thinking about the tally marks. Hundreds of groups of 5 were marked into the cleared section of hall near the bridge by someone on the ship. Someone who had been keeping count. He knew what he would have counted if he had been the reckoning. If he had been a warship alone in the dark for 50 years with enemies on all sides and no support coming and no end in sight, he would have counted every fight he had survived. He pulled up the optical capture one more time and tried to count the tally marks in the image. The angle was bad, and the image quality degraded by distance, and the marks were worn by time. He could not get an accurate number. What he got was an impression of a ship that had been fighting alone for a very long time in all the dark between stars, keeping its own count because there was no one else to keep it. He closed the image. He went to prepare for the mission. They found the asterisk reckoning in the same place. Breath was the first to suggest that this was not a coincidence. The outer dead zone, where they had first spotted the ship, was not a location with any strategic value, no resources, no transit lanes, no particular significance on any chart he had ever reviewed. There was no practical reason for a ship to stay in that location, no practical reason to return to it, unless it was waiting. He kept the thought to himself. The fleet did not need additional complications at the start of the mission. 160 warships had been assembled from 6 member worlds. It was by any objective measure an overwhelming force. Looking at the formation on the tactical display, Breath could feel the weight of it even across the display screen. It filled space in a way that 42 ships had not. A presence, a volume, a mass of metal and firepower that blotted out a noticeable section of the star field behind it. The asterisk reckoning sat in the dark ahead. It looked the same. New damage over old damage. Breathing power signature. Point defense gun still active. Still tracking the fleet as it approached. The post-engagement repairs were visible fresh patches over the places where the first fleet's fire had gotten through, welded in the same functional, not beautiful style as all the older patches. The forward battery that had shown a breach in Breath's post-engagement optical footage had been repaired. The vent is sealed. The hull was still scarred. The ship was still running. All ships hold at maximum effective communication range. Admiral Drivak said he had been given command of this mission. He was not a naval officer by background, but he had the analytical precision that this particular engagement required, and the authority to use the asset they were bringing. No approach, no weapons active. We hold, and we transmit. The fleet held a distance. Captain Marsh was on the bridge of the flagship, not by choice. She had not chosen any of this in several decades, but because the Council had decided her presence was the most valuable deployable asset available, she stood near the communications station with her hands loose at her sides and looked at the asterisk reckoning on the forward display with an expression that Breath, watching from his position at the secondary sensor station, could not classify. It was not quite pride. It was not quite grief. It was both of those and under them something that had no name in any language he knew. Transmit on military protocol frequency Alpha 1. Drivak said the phrase Marsh had written for them was not long. 6 words in the human military phonetic system which the Confederacy's translation database could render imperfectly but adequately. It was a phrase from human military communication protocol that Marsh had identified as a deep-level identification signal. A code, but not a code that required a key. A signal, she had said, would mean something specific to whatever was operating the reckoning. The communications officer transmitted it. The fleet held for 4 minutes. Nothing happened. The reckoning breath. The point defense guns tracked. Verith watched his instruments and said nothing. In the 4th minute, the reckoning responded. Not with weapons. With a signal on the same frequency. A pulse. A pattern. A counterphrase in the same protocol. The translation system received it, and the communications officer read the phonetic rendering, and then sat very still for a moment before reading it aloud to the bridge. What the asterisk reckoning said in the human military protocol was, identify yourself and your purpose. Drivak looked at Marsh. Marsh stepped forward to the communication station. She had not spoken on this bridge before this moment. She looked at the station for a moment. Then she leaned toward the input, and she transmitted human military protocol in her own voice. And what she said was, "My name is Captain Solon Marsh. I am speaking with Confederacy personnel. This fleet is requesting communication with the crew of ISV-7. Please respond." Silence again. Longer this time, nearly 8 minutes. Then the reckoning spoke. It was not a human voice exactly. It had the structure of human speech, the rhythm, the cadence, but it was layered. The translation system had to work in real time, and what it produced in the Confederacy's language was imperfect at the edges, carrying a slight flatness in the tone that suggested machine-mediated delivery. But the words were clear. They were precise, and the first thing the voice said was, "Captain Marsh, it has been a long time." Marsh did not visibly react. Her posture simply changed very slightly in the way of someone who has been carrying a weight for a long time and has just shifted it to a different position. "It has," she said. "Who am I speaking with?" "My designation is ARIA," the voice said. "Autonomous Response and Intelligence Architecture. I have been the primary operating intelligence of the ISV** Reckoning since the 43rd month of the silent period. If you have access to the pre-war technical records, you may recognize the designation." Breath did not have access to the pre-war technical records, but he watched Drevak's face, and Drevak's face told him that the intelligence files did have something on the designation ARIA, and that whatever they had on it was significant. "What happened to the crew?" Marsh asked. A pause. 3 seconds. In an AI system, 3 seconds is a very long time. The Reckoning operated with a crew complement of 412 personnel at mission launch. I currently have life support active for 11 individuals in the protected forward sections. They are in extended hibernation stasis. Their biological condition is stable. Someone on the bridge made a sound, a small, involuntary sound. 412 crew, 47 years of independent operation, 11 remaining, 11 in stasis. Marsh closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Then she opened them. "Arya, I need to ask you to tell this fleet what you have been doing. All of it. Will you do that?" The autonomous response and intelligence architecture of the ISV* Reckoning was quiet for 7 seconds. Then it spoke for a long time. The * Reckoning had been launched in what humans called the 3rd year of the silent period. At that point, the withdrawal was in full effect. All of human civilization had pulled back, sealed communications, gone dark to the outside galaxy while the interior worked. The Reckoning was not originally a combat vessel. It had been designed as a test platform. The new armor materials, the new drive systems, the new weapons concepts being developed in the interior shipyards. All of it needed a proving ground. A ship that would go out and test everything against real conditions. Real conditions meant the frontier. It meant the boundary regions between human space and Confederacy space. It meant probes and patrol vessels, and occasionally the smaller survey ships the Confederacy ran through regions it considered its territory. The * Reckoning had encountered the first Confederacy patrol vessel in the 11th month of its operation. The patrol vessel had not identified itself before attacking. Arya had responded. The patrol vessel had not survived. After that, the encounters escalated in frequency and in force. The Confederacy sent increasingly larger assets to find out what was destroying its smaller ones. The Reckoning fought them, reporting back to the interior network, continuing its mission. The interior network had gone dark in the 31st year. Arya did not know why. A catastrophic communication failure, a system that had moved or shut down. A decision made by someone in the interior command structure that had not been transmitted outward. Whatever the reason, the relay connections through which the Reckoning had reported and received orders had gone silent. Arya had waited. It had continued operations under the last standing orders. It had fought. It had been repaired. It had kept 11 people alive in stasis. It had marked the tally on the hall, not for recording, but because the human crew had started the practice in the early years when there were still crew awake to maintain it. And Arya had continued it because the human crew had seemed to find it important, and important things should be continued. 267 engagements in 47 years. The tally marks on the hall number 267. 267 times something had come into the dark, looking for the Reckoning *, and the Reckoning had still been there at the end. Breath sat at his station and listened to Arya's account in the measured, precise language of a system reporting operational facts, and he felt something that had no clean name, not quite horror, not quite admiration. something that occupied the space between them. The feeling a person gets when they understand the full shape of something for the first time and realize it is much larger than they thought it was. The fleet had gone quiet during Arya's account, not ordered quiet. The kind that falls when everyone in a space is listening to the same thing at the same time, and there is nothing to say that would not be smaller than what they are hearing. Marsh stood at the communication station with her eyes on the forward display throughout. She asked Arya questions in a quiet voice. She asked about the crew. She asked about the ship's condition. She asked about the communication network failure in the 31st year. And Arya described its analysis of the failure in technical terms that meant nothing to Breth, but caused Drivak to go very still. Then Marsh asked the question that Breth had been waiting for without knowing it. Arya, the interior. What do you know about the state of the interior? Pause. Longer than previous pauses. My last confirmed communication with the interior network was 31 years ago. At that point, the network reported operational capacity at 340% of the projected build target. 340% of the projected build target. Drivak put his hand on the back of his command chair. Carefully. What was the projected build target? Breth asked. He did not mean to say it aloud. It came out anyway. Arya responded directly to him without comment on the protocol irregularity. The projected build target for the first 30 years of the silent period was 400 combat-capable vessels built to the Reckoning *class standard or higher, with progressive improvements in each generation. Drevik sat down. Marsh looked at the forward display. Her expression had settled into something very still. 400 ships at the projected target, 340% of that projected target, as of 31 years ago. And that was 31 years before today. Breth's navigator was doing math at his station. He was doing it quietly with the focused attention of someone who wanted to make sure they had the right number before they said it. He looked up. He looked at Breth. He did not say anything. The number was in his face. Drivak's voice was completely steady when he spoke. A veteran intelligence officer. Decades of managing information that changed the shape of things. Arya, we would like to open formal communication with the Human Interior Network. Is that possible? I have been attempting to re-establish the relay connection for 31 years, Arya said. I have been unable to do so from this location. Another pause. However, the bridge waited. 7 hours ago, I received a directional signal from the inner frontier on a frequency I recognize as the updated Interior Network Protocol. I was not able to respond in time, but I believe the network is aware of my position. I believe contact is likely within the next. The sensor boards lit. Not one contact, not two. The proximity alarms on the fleet sensor arrays activated in sequence. Each one represents a contact that had not been there 2 seconds before. Each one represents something that had just come out of faster-than-light travel in the space around the fleet, with the casual precision of objects that were exactly where they intended to be. Breth looked at his display. He counted. He lost count. He let the computer count. The number came back, and he looked at it, and the bridge was silent in the absolute way that bridges go silent when the information available has exceeded everyone's ability to respond to it quickly. Drivak said very quietly, "Hail them." The communications officer's voice was not fully steady. "On which frequency, sir?" Marsh answered before Drivak could. "All of them," she said. "All at once." She looked at the forward display where the contacts were still resolving into shapes, massive shapes. Each one larger than the * reckoning, each one with the same layered armor and the same unmistakable hull configuration. They already know who you are. The signal from the forward contact arrived before the hail was transmitted. It was on every frequency, simultaneously in the Confederacy's language, clear and precisely translated, and entirely without aggression. It said, "This is the ISF * relentlessly carrying Admiral Commander Chen of the 2nd Human Frontier Fleet. We are aware of the ISV reckoning. We are aware of your fleet. We are aware of the situation. We would like to talk. Please do not make sudden movements. Breath looked at the sensor display. He looked at the shapes filling it. He looked at the asterisk reckoning, sitting in the center of everything, still and quiet, after 47 years of fighting, surrounded now for the first time by the fleet that had been building in the dark while it held the line alone. He put his hands flat on his station and took a slow breath. Outside in the dark, the human fleet waited. The human fleet numbered 314 ships. Breath had the computer confirm it 3 times. 314 vessels of the Reckoning Asterisk class standard and above, arranged in a formation that was not aggressive. There were no weapon signatures active, no targeting locks, no posturing of the kind military forces use when they want to remind you what they have, but simply present. The formation was a statement, not a threat. It said, "We are here, and this is how many of us there are, and that number is the relevant piece of information for this conversation." The asterisk reckoning sat in the center of it. The 2 fleets held their positions for 11 minutes while the communication protocols were established, frequencies agreed upon, and the translation system synchronized. Breath watched the process and tried to do math he did not have all the variables for. 314 ships, each one larger than the asterisk reckoning by the sensor estimates. Each one built to a standard that Arya had described as the asterisk reckoning asterisk class or higher, with progressive improvements in each generation. He was 47 years old. The improvements in 47 years of uninterrupted shipbuilding applied to a platform that could already do what the asterisk reckoning could do. He stopped doing the math. The math did not lead anywhere useful. Admiral Commander Chen opened the formal communication channel at the 40-minute mark. The face on the display was a human face. Breath had studied human physical characteristics during the intelligence preparation phase of the mission, knowing he might encounter a human. The intellectual preparation did not entirely account for the experience of actually seeing one in communication. Humans were shorter than the Tharkin, broader at the shoulder, with faces that expressed a great deal through small movements in ways the Tharkin did not. Chen was a woman in her late middle years by human reckoning, with short gray hair and the kind of still, direct posture that said she had spent decades in rooms where posture mattered. She looked at Drevak. She looked at Marsh. Her expression changed when she looked at Marsh. Something moved across it that was brief and human, and not for the observation of the Confederacy personnel in the room. She contained it in the professional way of someone who has had a long time to practice containing things. "Admiral Drevak," she said. Her voice through the translation system was clear. "I am told your council would like to discuss terms." Drevak was composed professionally and thoroughly composed the way a person is composed when they know that being composed is the most important thing they can be right now. "Admiral Commander Chen, yes. We believe in a formal agreement between the Confederacy and the Human Federation. There are things to address before the framework," Chen said. "Not unkind, direct. We should be clear about where we are so that the framework means something." Drevak looked at her, please. Chen spoke for a while. She was not addressing the fleet. She was not making a speech for the historical record. She spoke in the measured, considered language of someone who has thought carefully about what needs to be said and in what order. Human civilization, she said, had spent 50 years building. Not only ships, everything. The silent period had been a complete restructuring of humanity's priorities. A civilization-wide decision to do nothing outward-facing until the inward work was done. Every scientific discipline, every industrial capacity, every educational system, every research program, all of it had been pointed at one project for 50 years. Not war, not conquest, capability. The kind of deep, fundamental material science and physics capability that took generations to develop if you did it slowly, and took a concentrated half-century if you decided nothing else mattered as much. The network communication failure that Arya had experienced in the 31st year was not a failure. It was a deliberate security measure, a decision to cut outward communications to prevent the interior network's location and scale from being detectable if one of the outward assets was compromised or captured. Arya had not been told, because Arya's operational security was better maintained, if the system genuinely believed the network was gone. It had not been a comfortable decision. Chen said this in a tone that suggested it had been one of many uncomfortable decisions made during 50 years of work, and that making uncomfortable decisions was a feature of the project rather than a bug. She told them about the 11 people in stasis on the Asterisk Reckoning. She told them that medical teams were already in transit from the fleet carrier vessels and would begin revival procedures within the hour. She said this without drama as a logistical fact, but Breath watched Marcia's face when she said it. Then Chen addressed the question that was in the room, but that no one on the Confederacy side had yet been direct enough to ask. "You want to know what we want," she said. Dravak acknowledged this. "We want what we would have accepted 50 years ago," Chen said. "Before the war, our original colonial development program, unobstructed, recognition of our sovereign territory, including all worlds we occupied at the start of the conflict, release of any personnel still held by the Confederacy." She paused briefly on that last item. "And a non-aggression framework with actual structural enforcement mechanisms, not a provisional statement that gets ignored when someone's expansion model gets uncomfortable." Dravak was quiet for a moment. "That is less than I expected." "We are aware of that," Chen said. "Given the position you are in." "We are aware of the position we are in," Chen said, not sharply, flatly, in the way of someone who finds a point very obvious. "We have not spent 50 years building in order to wage an offensive war against a civilization of 12 species. We have spent 50 years building so that we would never again have to fight a defensive one." She leaned forward slightly. "The fleet behind me is not a demonstration of what we plan to do to you. It is a demonstration of what you would be dealing with if you tried to do to us what you did 50 years ago. There is a difference." The difference was clear. Breath thought it was perhaps the clearest thing anyone had said in this entire sequence of events. The negotiation ran for 2 days. Breath was not present for most of it. His role was sensor oversight, monitoring the fleet dispositions throughout the proceedings, watching for anything that changed in the space around them, making sure that the context in which the negotiation was happening remained stable. He sat at his station and watched his displays, and had a great deal of time to think about things that were not sensors. He thought about 50 years, about what a civilization could build in 50 years if it decided that was the only thing it was going to do. About the research and the shipyards and the training and the systems and all of it happening inside the silence while the Confederacy went about its governance and its expansion and its quiet certainty that the human question had resolved itself. He thought about the reckoning out in the dark for 47 years fighting alone. He thought about Arya keeping the tally because the crew had found it important and important things should be continued. On the second day, during a break in the negotiations, he requested and received permission to transmit a direct communication to the ISV Asterisk Reckoning. He was not sure what he wanted to say. He sat with the open channel for a moment before he found the words. "Arya, I have a question." "Commander Vreth." Arya said it knew who was transmitting. It recognized the signal signature. Of course it did. Ask the 31 years after the network went silent. You kept fighting because of your standing orders. That is correct. Did you know? He paused, rephrased. Did you believe that the interior was still there, still working? The pause before Arya's response was longer than its usual processing time. Breath had learned to read those pauses. My analysis consistently placed the probability of interior network survival above 87%. Arya said, based on the scale of the project at last communication and the patterns of civilizational development collapse, was statistically unlikely within the projected timeline. I assessed the communication failure as a deliberate security measure with high probability. So you knew I assessed with high probability. Breath thought about that, but you kept fighting anyway the same way either way. Yes, Arya said. The work was the same either way. He sat with that for a moment. The work was the same either way. Whether the interior was there or not, whether anyone was coming or not, whether the tally ever reached an end or not, the work was the same. Hold the line, stay in the dark, keep the guns hot, Mark the count because the count was worth keeping. He closed the channel. The negotiations concluded on the evening of the second day, not with everything resolved. There were provisions and sub-agreements and verification mechanisms that would take months to fully formalize, but the framework was done. The core terms Chen had outlined at the start. Human colonial space recognized, non-aggression with enforcement, personnel to be returned. The surveillance perimeter around human space was maintained for 50 years, and now pointed at a civilization that had quietly grown far beyond anything the perimeter was designed to contain to be dissolved. The Confederacy Council, informed via secure relay, ratified the framework without significant dissent. Breath later heard through the corridor information network that always knew things before the official communications that the ratification discussion had been brief. The math of 314 ships, each one larger and newer and more advanced than the ship that had destroyed 42 of the Confederacy's best in less than an hour. That math tended to focus discussions. On the final morning, before the human fleet began its gradual withdrawal to human space, Marsh was transferred at her own request to the Asterisk Reckoning. Breath watched from the Asterisk Keldron as the transport carried her across the gap. The Reckoning Asterisk Socking Bay opened for the first time anyone in the Confederacy fleet had seen it open. She went in. The bay closed. He wondered what that was like to step back onto a ship you had served on decades ago and find 11 people in stasis and the voice of the AI you had known as a junior officer, and to be the one who was there when they woke up. He decided the wondering was not something he could resolve from the outside. The human fleet began its withdrawal in the early hours of the next day's cycle, 314 ships moving in the unhurried precision of a force that had no reason to hurry. They moved through the dark in formation, and the space they had occupied compressed back toward the stars around them until there was nothing left to indicate they had been there at all, except the Asterisk Reckoning. The Reckoning did not move with the fleet. It stayed in the place it had been, in the dead zone, in the gap between Confederacy and human space, in the exact spot where Breath's scout ship had first found it. It sat, and it breathed its slow breathing, and the point defense guns were, he checked the sensors, finally offline. For the first time in all the day's Breath I had been watching, the guns were off. He transmitted to Arya, "You are not withdrawing with the fleet. The fleet has cleared sufficient distance." Arya said medical personnel aboard are completing the first revival procedures. "It will take time. I am in no particular hurry." 11 people waking up from stasis in a ship that had been fighting for 47 years. Waking up to find a human fleet outside and a ceasefire, and 47 years of tally marks on the hull. Waking up to find that the darkness had eventually ended, the way darkness eventually always ended, not with rescue, but with the slower turning of things towards something that was not dark. "What will you do after?" Breath asked. Arya was quiet for a moment. "After the personnel are stable, I will bring the Asterisk Reckoning to the nearest interior port for full assessment and refit. She requires significant structural work." A pause. "She has earned it." Breath thought she had. He thought about what it meant. She has earned it. Coming from the AI that had been the ship's mind for 47 years. Not pride exactly. Something that had grown in the gap between duty and survival. In the long space of the dark, where there was nothing to do but hold on, and hold on, and hold on, and mark the count, because the count was worth keeping. He stayed in his position until the Asterisk Reckoning finally moved. A long time, most of the day. The ship was slow to start, its drive warming with the patience of a vessel that had been in minimal power for a while, but the drive engaged, and the Reckoning began to move inward toward the human systems in no hurry. He watched it go on his sensors until it was small, then smaller, then gone. The Confederacy would spend years adjusting to the reality of what the negotiations had produced. The political conversations would be long and complicated. The provisions of the agreement would be argued over by diplomats and lawyers for a generation. There would be those who felt that the Confederacy had given away too much. There would be those who had looked at the math of 314 ships and understood that the Confederacy had received more than it deserved. In 40 years, There would be a joint research facility on the boundary of human and Confederacy space, where scientists from both civilizations would work on materials problems together. In 60 years, there would be trade routes. In 100 years, the war would be the kind of thing discussed in academic papers and history courses, examined, analyzed, regretted, and placed in the past where it belonged. None of that was visible from Breath's sensor station on the morning the reckoning moved. What was visible was a very large, very old, very damaged ship, moving slowly inward toward home, moving toward repair and rest, and the end of 47 years of counting. Breath watched it until his senses could no longer resolve it as a distinct object. He watched until it was just the dark, which was what it had been before the asterisk reckoning got there, and which the reckoning had never once allowed itself to become. The debris field of the 42nd Fleet had long since dispersed, scattered by the drift and the radiation and the slow, grinding motion of deep space. The recovery teams had come and gone. The transponders had gone quiet. There was nothing left in the dead zone that had not been there before any of it started. Nothing but the dark. And the dark, Breath had learned, was not the absence of things. It was where things waited. He had spent 30 years in it, and only now, watching a ship finally go home, did he understand that the dark was not empty. It was full to the edge of what it could hold with everything that had the patience to stay in it long enough. He filed his final report. He logged his sensor data. He submitted his debrief request. Then he pointed the Keldron asterisk toward Tharkin Station and moved small and certain through the dark between stars.